good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Audrey Mossberger, and I'm Director of Events at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone today to the event Taiwan's Coordinated Response to Disinformation. Following opening remarks by NBR's president, Roy Kamphausen, we'll jump right into a moderated discussion with our two expert panelists. For those joining us here on WebEx and via live stream, please email your questions to events@nbr.org. You don't have to wait until the discussion starts, and in fact, we encourage you to send those in throughout the event, as you might find that your question is addressed. If not, our moderator will do her best to present all questions to our panel in our allotted time today. Finally, the video recording of today's event will be available on our website at nbr.org shortly after the event. Thank you all again for joining what is sure to be a very engaging and informative discussion today. And with that, I will turn it over to Roy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Audrey. And good morning to participants on the U.S. East Coast, and welcome to others joining from around the world. I'm Roy Kamphausen, President of NBR. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this discussion on NBR's recently published report, Taiwan's Response to Disinformation, a model for coordination to counter a complicated threat, authored by our guest today, Mr. Shih-Shiuan Kao. Welcome, Wilson. Mr. Gao's research effectively lays out Taiwan's coordinated response to disinformation, and it's critical for understanding how the government and civil society in Taiwan have functioned in recent years to put forward necessary strategies to deal with this new set of challenges. Disinformation campaigns carried out by the People's Republic of China seek to pressure Taiwan and have proven to be very difficult to detect, deter, and counter. And disinformation poses broader challenges for Taiwan and other democracies, as its influence undermines fundamental democratic values and institutions, disrupts a free and fair electoral process, weaponizes, in some cases, the open and transparent media landscape, and erodes public trust in the democratic system. In addition, the spread of disinformation by the PRC and other malign regimes will allow authoritarianism to extend its reach. Nevertheless, Taiwan has been developing a coordinated response to the PRC disinformation campaigns since 2018, following attempts to influence results of the 2018 midterm elections and the tragic suicide of Taiwan diplomat Su Chur-chong. The government has facilitated interagency partnerships to develop counter-disinformation policies and procedures, while fact-checking mechanisms and greater public awareness of disinformation. These have all been elevated for consideration in civil society. Although Taiwan has made notable and innovative strides, many challenges persist, particularly in the areas of new legislation, measuring the success of counter-disinformation efforts and the lack of transparency and resistance to regulations from social media platforms. Our experts gathered virtually here today will discuss the findings of Mr. Gao's report, and we're grateful that our former NBR colleague, Melissa, is here to play an important discussant role, with a focus on the nature of PRC different disinformation campaigns in Taiwan, Taiwan's coordinated response, and the implications of Taiwan's effort for other democracies. Before we begin our discussion, thanks to my NBR colleagues, Rachel Bernstein, Audrey Mossberger, and Darlene Onora for their hard work in putting together this event. And with that, let me turn it over now to our colleague, Rachel Bernstein, who will be introducing our speakers and moderating today's discussion. Thank you once again to everyone for joining. And Rachel, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Roy. My name is Rachel Bernstein, and I'm a project manager with the Political and Security Affairs Group at NBR, and it is my pleasure to be moderating this panel today. As Roy mentioned, we're joined by two excellent panelists who will dig into the details of Taiwan's response to disinformation campaigns. Before I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to say a quick reminder that if you have a question for our panelists, please submit them via email at events@nbr.org. I'll now introduce the panelists all at once and in the order they will be speaking. So Wilson, starting with you. Wilson or Shih-Shiuan Kao is the author of MBR's recently published report, Taiwan's Response to Disinformation, a Model for Coordination to Counter a Complicated Threat. Mr. Kao is an independent policy researcher whose work focuses on mapping the legal and policy tools for the prevention of undue foreign interference on democratic society. Mr. Kao previously was a legal researcher for Doublethink Lab, a Taiwanese NGO working on understanding influence operations and developing tools and policy suggestions for counteractions. He was also a legislative assistant specializing in criminal policy, judicial reform, and digital privacy of Ms. Mei Nu Yu, a senior lawyer and well-respected human rights advocate in Taiwan during 2018 to 2020. And now Melissa Newcomb is a senior program manager for the Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China Liberal Influence programs at the National Democratic Institute. Previously, she managed the Taiwan portfolio at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Ms. Newcomb was a founding member of the Global Taiwan Institute, which launched in 2016. At GTI, she created the Civil Society and Democracy series, which invited activists and experts from Taiwan to Washington, D.C. to speak about their work. Her current research is focused on Taiwan's digital democracy reforms as a fellow for the U.S.-Taiwan Next Generation Working Group at the Institute of East Asian Studies at UC Berkeley. Her recently published article in The Diplomat, Can Taiwan Provide the Alternative to Digital Authoritarianism, is based on her preliminary research. She holds a BA in English Literature and Asian Studies from St. Mary's College of Maryland and an MA in International Affairs with a focus on East Asia and conflict resolution from American University. I'll now turn it over to our panelists to begin the discussion. Wilson, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So before let me think. Okay. Just before this panel, our host Rachel just sent me some questions, so I'll start with the first question she just gave me. She is asking me to tell us more about the Taiwan's efforts on improving the public media's literacy to realize the identification facets of Taiwanese four-facet framework to counter disinformation. And there are actually two parts of this facet, government actions and the civil society parts. And for the government action, I already discussed something like the curriculum guidelines and training programs in my report, so I will not repeat that part. But for the civil society part, I think it is more interesting and inspiring, and some of them have not been reported in my writing, so I would like to mention particularly one civil society group working on community reach out project. So, but before I dive into the project by this group, I want to clarify some Taiwanese context. And just few years ago in Taiwan, the market share of smartphones and access of mobile broadband connection quickly expanded. Once upon a time, unlimited 4G data plan in Taiwan only cost $18 per month. Actually, that is very attractive to the general public. So this quick expansion essentially drags most of Taiwanese people into online activities, including the elder people. So that is the context. And these elder people are relatively unaware of the pitfalls of online life, and since most of them are already retired, so they become immersed into the internet. In the end, these elder people are one of the most susceptible population to disinformation, and the dissemination of disinformation among these elder people somewhat mirrors the existing offline community network. So this group, its name is Fake News Cleaner, and it's based in central Taiwan. And they go to the local community to reach out residents face to face, especially to the elder people, for the fact that these elder people are susceptible, but they still have some offline gathering activities, so they can be reached out. And this group our fake news cleaner teaches these elder residents how to discern disinformation, begin with disinformation on health, because health issues are elders' primary concern and less sensitive than political disinformation. And the civil society groups teach them how to dissect and verify online messages they got. And those skills can also be applied to other kind of disinformation messages as well. So their results are quite amazing, as many elders they have reached out continuously perform these skills on different categories of disinformation with good feedbacks. Okay, so right now I'm not going. Although I present a so-called good Taiwanese model or Taiwanese good story, but I'm not suggesting that this case can be directly replicated in other nations, as contexts are different. But I think the general principle we can draw from this case is that before we doing reach out, we should at least have some preliminary insights to know where are the susceptible groups, and you have to identify these groups based on some methodology. Then we can need to understand their living style, their beliefs on how they perceive the world, and what's their community structures. And only after that, we can finally discuss other things like reach out plan, materials, and assistive tools, and and their counter narrative for them. So I think you can see this workflow takes some time to develop, and it is often determined by how the target communities interact with outsiders. And in real life, in Taiwan, there are still communities could not be reached out easily, as the case I just elaborated. And there are some populations with weak community ties, and that is the hard part. So I think I want to mention this case as a supplement of my report, because I don't have much spare time to put so many cases inside of a tiny report to show the complexity of Taiwanese situation. Okay. And the second, Rachel, shall I finish, or shall I stop here, or can I move on to the next part? Sorry.
You can keep going for, I think you have like a few more minutes left, and then we'll turn it over to Melissa.
Okay, good. And also, I want to mention another problems that another part that I didn't address in my report, but I think it's worth mentioning to all the audience, is that what kind of digital tools or strategies are necessary for Taiwan to better monitor the dissemination of disinformation on social media platforms, and how can we strengthen them? And I think I didn't mention that in my report, but the majority of monitoring of disinformation relies on pulling open data out of platforms, and by diligence and log, analysts can find out some traces of potential collaborated and authentic behaviors. And researchers in Taiwan also relies on user reports of possible disinformation circulated inside of messaging service like WhatsApp or Line, as some of our fact-check groups have developed a public database for that, so users can report what they see as disinformation and upload them. And my former colleagues in Doublethink Lab has performed additional analysis based on narratives, writing styles, or alignment of PRC state media of these messages, and try to develop tools to do it automatically, or at least semi-automatically. But I think this approach have two major hurdles on data availabilities and two methodology challenges we need to overcome. The first one is that researchers like my former colleagues at Doublethink Lab cannot collect enough relevant data on social platforms. Facebook and Twitter's at least grant researchers access to public posts and other limited metadata about individual accounts or pages or groups. While YouTube, actually in Taiwan, is one of the major hosts of weaponized messages from TPRC. But YouTube gives far more limited information. And this is the first one. And the second hurdle on data availability is that for messaging service, there are no way to determine how many times and how many hops has the message being forwarded through, and other than users' reports. So researchers like my colleague cannot correctly estimate how far this message has penetrated. So to overcome this hurdle, I hope that social platforms and messaging service should be more transparent and develop creative ways with researchers to disclose more useful data and metadata without sacrificing the privacy of users. But how to make platforms and messaging service willing to cooperate is another topic, and I wish we can discuss them in the later session. And on the methodology challenge to overcome, the first is to estimate how serious and how far a disinformation campaign goes, like we estimate and monitor an epidemic outbreak. We need to build a dynamic model that can be used when relevant data sets are not complete, like we are monitoring an unknown disease outbreak, but we have to estimate after all. And we have to find out the plausible range of relevant epidemic parameters based on past outbreaks. So in that sense, we need more data sets of curated cases and experts from other disciplines to get this done. And the second challenge on methodology is that we need to expand the analysis on these weaponized message, focusing on writing style, alignment, and to do it in a more formal way. Because we have concluded that, my doublethink dev have concluded that there are so many different actors inside of the PRC or CCP apparatus to initiate disinformation campaigns, each with different intention and patterns of attacks. Therefore, we being able to distinguish different kinds of campaigns based on styles and alignments help us to develop a better typology for attribution of attackers within the PRC or CCP. And luckily, we can achieve further goals like forecasting possible future campaigns based on our knowledge of typology of attackers and their dynamics or their intentions. So that's the two supplements I want to raise, and I hope I didn't waste too much time. Okay, I finished.
Thank you very much, Wilson. I think you made some really interesting points that we'll be able to talk more about later on in our discussion. But Melissa, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank NBR for having me back. It's always nice to be among old colleagues. And I really want to thank Wilson and Doublethink Lab for all their work, because as you can tell, we could not contain everything that Wilson had found and all the research he had done and all the really thorough interviews. And so we really had to keep it more focused, but he did so much work on this report and really value that effort. So I was going to take a step back and talk about the purpose of the report itself from my perspective while I was at NBR. And it was really to look at not the content of dis or misinformation in Taiwan, even though that subject matter is extremely important and Doublethink Lab covers that themselves, but really to understand why Taiwan was successful between what happened in the midterm 2018 elections and then the 2020 presidential elections. Because I think that is what's going to be most useful for other democracies, but also it's the part that I think will be sustainable in the long run, since disinformation, the content of disinformation itself is always evolving and changing, and the methods that it's deployed is also always changing really quickly. But if we have a sustainable framework to learn from, that's something that can be replicated elsewhere and will last longer than any specific disinformation campaign. And so given the nature of disinformation and the way that it is always changing, I think the best way to counter it is to increase the resilience of the population. And that demands a whole of society response, which is what we saw in Taiwan. And that's what's described in this report. In addition, Wilson really deftly kind of outlines how Taiwan's government thought through what is disinformation and the policies that they implemented. And so there's that 3-part criteria that's described: the malice, falsehood, and harm. And I think that's extremely useful and effective. And even though it's simple, it probably took them a long time to come up with how do we define disinformation, and also put it in terms that are easy for anyone to understand and use themselves when they're looking at, social media. They can discern whether or not it's disinformation if they think through these three steps. As also outlined in the report are the four-part facet or framework: identification, debunking, combating, and punishing. And I think Taiwan's really shown the most innovation in the identification and the debunking parts of that framework. As Wilson just described, a very unique way of teaching social media literacy, and not only looking at younger people, but also looking at older generations, so looking at across society. And I think that those kinds of identification or media literacy campaigns is really what's going to pay the most dividends over time in Taiwan if they continue those kinds of interventions. And then debunking, I mean, it sounds really simple. Oh, use humor over rumor and act quickly, but governments are not generally known for being funny or moving quickly. And so the fact that Taiwan's government was able to create those interagency teams that could move in that way, I think is really amazing, impressive, and something that other governments could learn from. And then at the heart of this report, though, I think what maybe we unintentionally uncovered was this Taiwan model, which is how civil society and the government are working not together, but in ways that are mutually beneficial, and sort of responding to each other, but not directly collaborating. And it's a really delicate and sort of strange balance that they're holding. It's the hardest thing, I think, for other democracies to replicate, but I think it's the most important part. And it's not explicitly stated in the report, but that mutually beneficial relationship is really founded on trust and communication, and the fact that there's this really robust and active civic tech community in Taiwan. And so I think that aspect is really the most interesting thing that we found out from Wilson's research. So yeah, I just want to thank Wilson again, and I'll stop there so we can go into the discussion.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I think both you and Wilson kind of touched on how the PRC has different evolving tactics of disinformation, and the Taiwan model will have to keep evolving and eventually respond to different tactics that are continually getting more elaborate or more perhaps successful or difficult to detect. And I was wondering if you could both speak to where you see these PRC tactics going, and if there are any elements of the Taiwan model that you see right now that might need to change or be altered in order to be more sustainable in the future.
Wilson, do you want to go first?
Sorry, I think it's a great question, but it takes me more time. I need more time to think of that. So if you have any comment, please go first. Sorry.
Well, I can go a little bit, and then I think, I can say, in terms of PRC tactics, I'll be transparent and say my research is really more focused on Taiwan and how it's evolving in the digital age. But I will say something anecdotally that I've noticed recently is that I think Chinese disinformation in the English-speaking sphere is getting savvier. It's shaping discourse more often. It's getting reposted more often. Before, I think English language disinformation from the PRC was clunky at best and rarely gained traction. And I'm starting to see it is having more influence. And that could have implications for Taiwan in the sense that it could shape public perception of Taiwan in English-speaking countries in a negative way if they continue to really sort of become even more effective. And so I think that's something we need to be vigilant about.
Okay. And my opinion is that first, our former colleagues in top thing that have concluded that Taiwan has been a primary experiment field for their tactics. So in my previous investigation by my colleagues, they have found out that maybe a narrative or some kind of message appears in Taiwan, and maybe 2 months later, the similar messages appear in Japan or in the United States or in European countries. So I think that is why Taiwan is important, because it serves as a canary in the coal mine for PRC tactics. So, and in the overall, I think the trend of PRC's tactics is basically aligned with their styles on intelligence. I mean, they are doing trial and errors. And so, and their tactics focus on how to make people exhausted. And then they are going to seek for simple answers, for simple heuristics to understand the politics and policies issues. And they even become much more easily to be incited emotionally, but not by rationales. So on, they become motivated by serious discussion. And I think it's hard to counter these tactics fully, but only partially, because media literacy education and reach out is important, and also disclosure of these campaigns or tactics and to raise awareness is important. But there are still a hard limit, which is the cognitive capacity of modern human being. And as previous cognitive and behaviors research shows that when people are overworked, isolated, or stressed, like Taiwanese people are stressed under the threat of war from the PRC, then people are easily exhausted. And in other words, having a good enough social life with support may be the necessary foundation to disinformation immunity, no matter this kind of immunity is served for the PRC propaganda or other kind of disinformation. And I think although we can do many policy or civil society intervention, but this hard part is the hardest to be addressed. And I think China PRC will always use this kind of leverage to advance their state interests through the disinformation campaigns. Okay.
Thank you so much. Just a reminder to our audience, we will open it up to audience questions shortly, so please do send any questions you have to events@mbr.org. Then my next question is, Wilson, you also kind of touched on this a little bit in your initial presentation, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit, where you said that Taiwan's model is not necessarily able to be exactly replicated in other countries, but there are areas that are common, such as specific vulnerable populations. And I was wondering if you could just expand, or if you could both expand a bit on what aspects of Taiwan's model could potentially be replicated in other democracies, say maybe Japan or even the United States.
I think in the abstract level, or in the level of principle, like Melissa just concluded that Taiwanese model is that we share the same terminology and conceptual framework between government and the civil society, but we work in parallel. So civil society can retain their independence and integrity, which is especially important under the polarized political atmosphere, no matter in Taiwan, in US, United States, in Europe, or in Japan. I think that this part are also useful in other countries, and also some general principle, like to make the government the layers so that they can make response more swiftly, or the principle of community reach out I just mentioned. And that can be, I think these kind of principles are also useful and applicable in other countries. But to make these principles useful, we have to make aware of more local context, so that I think governments or civil society who want to make interventions have to know more about the local community structures, especially when the country is large and there are so many diverse communities, and the strategies for intervention for all of them might be very different or might be very diverse. And yeah, I think we should, there are much field work for civil society groups to work on it. Okay, my first instinct. Yeah, that is my first instinct of your questions.
Thank you. Melissa, would you like to add?
Yeah, I would. And I think Wilson, like, it's like your psychic, because you really touched on something I was going to bring up. And I'll start with what I was going to be my later point first, which is I think one way in which the US, Japan, or other larger societies, maybe more diverse societies, one way they can use the Taiwan model is to go local and to think, rather than just thinking at, oh, this is a national plan, so it has to be replicated nationally elsewhere. Actually, it might be more beneficial to think at the state or city level and really look at how disinformation impacts certain communities, because disinformation is targeted at certain people. And so trying to do a national plan in the US might be extremely difficult, and maybe not sustainable to start with that. And so, what that entails, though, going local means thinking of creating, these kind of nimble interagency debunking teams, maybe at state governments, thinking through how to invest in civic tech communities, because they do exist in the US, but I think that they're more disparate or maybe more concentrated in urban centers. And then that also relates to closing the digital divide in larger countries where, especially in the US, where, urban centers highly technically, advanced, or infrastructure is all there, whereas and then you leave those urban centers and it becomes less and less so, or just high disparity between high income folks and lower income folks. And then investing, I think those public media literacy campaigns, I keep harping on them, but I really think that they are something that are low cost, are easy to diffuse throughout society, and could have the biggest impact over the long term. So those are ways in which I think Taiwan's model can be exported elsewhere. But at the end of the day, you really do have to have high trust in the government. And we've seen throughout COVID-19, the breakdown in communication between governments and publics has led to a kind of increase of distrust. And so I think the very first thing is that governments at every level will need to repair that trust between the public in order to then counter disinformation effectively.
Okay, I want to supplement one point, is that I think although the performance of Taiwanese government during the pandemic is relatively good, but there are still some mistrust toward the government in Taiwan. So I think going local and reach out by independent civil society workers is important and is essential for the beginning. And it's easier to find out a community that still have some relatively integrate. I mean, if this kind of communities still have physical gathering, and they have relatively compact daily interactions, then the intervention, like the one I mentioned in the fake news cleaner, and this kind of intervention is much easier. But when there are no so-called community, or there are no good quality daily interaction offline, then this kind of intervention would be more difficult. So I think the intervention is actually a variation of community works. Okay. Yeah.
You've both mentioned this idea of focusing on the community and going local, and brought up media literacy programs. And I was wondering if you could just kind of go into and describe what is in these media literacy programs is effective, and like if there are any things that other countries could adopt, or if you think, like, what do you think the level of success is in this media literacy program?
I think the most success part of the media literacy program in Taiwan, based on the case I described in the report and I described in this panel, is that we develop our media literacy based on our preliminary understanding of the target population. For example, one target population is the elder people, and we know that okay, the priority of their concern is health. So, and there are many health disinformation. So, the civil society groups design their program firstly on health, how to discern health disinformation, and let them practice on to how to discern them and how to debunk them, how to verify them, and suggest them can apply this kind of technique into other kinds of disinformation. And the other part is that the other target population is teacher. They have to teach these kind of techniques to students from range from the K-12, the kindergarten to the 12th grade. And so, and in that sense, they didn't really create a complete package for teachers, but actually they develop cases and develop the general principle and teach the teachers, and the teachers will develop further refined materials and refined program by themselves. And I think these two examples are two different paradigms, but they are maybe useful or applicable. But I think there need many fine tunings according to the local context in different countries.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that I was going to bring up that it's embedded in the school systems in Taiwan, and that could be controversial in the US. You know, every school system operates very differently, but it could be one approach.
Yeah.
And then I've also seen in Taiwan and elsewhere this idea of like using games to increase media literacy and making it fun and approachable. And then this general principle of like not being judgmental. So, shaming people for falling prey to disinformation is not going to help. And so having that approach to it, of framing it in this is just a problem that everyone might have at some point, and this is how you can, anyone can fall prey to it. It doesn't mean you're not smart, and here are some tactics for you to use in your daily life.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I'll now turn over to some audience questions. And our first one is if you could comment a bit more on the humor over rumor, given that the use of rumor by Russian attackers in Europe to deflect critical thinking.
Okay, I think the Taiwanese emphasis on humor is that using humor makes this the clarification much easier to be remembered and to be spread upon, so that the counter narrative of the debunking message can spread further to the targeted audience. But as you rightly mentioned, that sometimes the disinformation or the harmful narrative is not only about fact, is about like the standpoint, or they have an implicit arguments on maybe like the difference of different institutions or different regime, and this kind of difference I don't think can be easily addressed on the humor. But I think humor is being humor and being humorous and being non-judgmental is an essential to have this kind of conversation, so that these kinds of harmful narrative or harmful messages or disinformation can be addressed properly, can be addressed in a less exhaustive way, so that people can get involved more easily. Okay.
It's a good point. I mean, I think I don't want to speak for Audrey Tang or the Taiwanese government, but I think that they learned from that kind of harmful meme culture in a way to then create positive or debunking memes. And it's not a solution to fix every problem. It's more like a very specific intervention for specific rumors that are gaining traction and that could be harmful. So they don't create them for every single piece of disinformation out there. They have like criteria and it has to reach a certain threshold, as Wilson described in the report. But we can't defeat disinformation and internet culture without using internet culture, and we need to learn from it and use the things that people will share. And I just think that using humor to kind of incite people to share actual true information is a good way to go, but it's not the only solution or the ultimate solution.
Thank you. Our next question is, are there any countries that have replicated or otherwise followed the Taiwan model to combat disinformation? Or are there any specific countries that are particularly vulnerable and need to adopt a Taiwan model?
I don't think anyone has replicated it yet. Wilson, correct me if I'm wrong, but I also think it's because it's not widely known, and it's, we made it sound simple, but it's actually complicated to replicate. How do you create those interagency task force? How do you delayer a large government bureaucracy? Those things take time, and that's why I do think maybe thinking at the local level might be better. But that also means building the capacity of local governments. So, the city, I'm in Baltimore right now, so the city of Baltimore's capacity to handle disinformation could be very, very different from, say, New York City. And so we also have to address, the capacity of different governments.
Yes. Okay. I have nothing to supplement. Yeah.
Our next question is about implications of disinformation on Taiwan society. So would you say that Beijing is succeeding in disseminating and having Taiwan people believe in its narrative? And if yes, what are the implications for Taiwan's democratic process if it means the public is being divided? And if no, what elements of Taiwan's model are particularly successful in preventing the success of disinformation campaigns?
So I'm not really sure I understand this question clearly. So, but okay, I think the basic problem of sorry, I think I need to hear the question again so I can have more correct understanding on the core of the questions.
Sure, no problem. So in your view, is Beijing succeeding in disseminating and having Taiwan believe in its narrative, such as Taiwan is inevitably going to be united with China, or the U.S. is going to abandon Taiwan after pulling out of Afghanistan? And if yes, what are the implications for Taiwan's democratic process if it means the public is being divided? And if no, what elements of Taiwan's model have been particularly effective in combating this disinformation?
Okay, I think it's a little bit hard to assess a specific kind of the impact of a specific kind of narrative, because the main problem is that we don't know how to measure it. Although we can have doing polls, but it's very hard to discerning every factors, the effect of the particular effect of the disinformation or by the harmful narrative by PRC. So honestly, I cannot give you very concrete answers. But in a more abstract level, I think I think the goal of PRC narrative is that actually I don't think most of the disinformation campaigns from the PRC really works just as they want people to believe their message. No, their only I think their only impact is to make people exhausted and to make people think, oh, I just don't want to care about this kind of fuss. So I don't think these kind of narrative really directly directly to form or to shape the discussion, to direct the discussion of in Taiwanese context. And about the impact on the local democratic process, I have to say that as you many of the audience might know, that Taiwan will have a referendum in December, and I think this kind of disinformation campaign is still important because, in fact, when these kind of discussion is maybe this kind of narrative or disinformations make people exhausted, and what people will do is that they will follow their instinct, they will follow their heuristics, or they will follow their advice of their neighbors. In that kind, there are certain parties of different standpoints. They can mobilize their they will mobilize their supporters. So in the end, I think people may be decide how to cast their vote not by rationale, but by their how they be mobilized by different actors, including some actors that are local collaborators by to the PRC, and I think that is the worrying part. The impact of these campaigns does not work like mostly or partially. It does not work like making you believe they're saying, but make you that being exhausted and being tired of the serious discussion.
I agree with Wilson in that it's really hard to measure the success of these different disinformation campaigns from China because, while we know their overarching goal, like Wilson mentioned, of trying to break down trust in Taiwan society and increase polarization, we don't know the specific tactical goals of every specific campaign. I do think you can kind of use 3 layers to see if something was successful, any kind of, in the context of Taiwan, any kind of disinformation. Those 3 layers are probably, did it just create general discord or polarization? It's a pretty easy win. I think it's any rumor can do that. Did it create a negative perception of Taiwan or its leaders among its domestic population and abroad? That's harder to tell if that's successful or not, but you can, if certain rumors are just never seem to go away, then probably you can see like, oh, that was a successful one. And then I think like the ultimate goal that the PRC is always striving for with its disinformation campaigns is changing the outcomes of elections, referendums, like Wilson mentioned, or pieces of legislature and votes. And this is something they've tried to do for a long time, going back even before digital technology. Their long history of information warfare, propaganda, and the use of traditional media. There are many media outlets in Taiwan that have either owners who are from China or people with much at stake in China, either business or otherwise, who own media companies in Taiwan. And so this isn't a new problem, but it's has a new face or a new form these days. And so I guess, if we look at 2018, we could say China was relatively successful at all 3 of those levels. In the presidential 2020 election, much less so. And right now, if we want to look at a case study, I think COVID-19 is a good one. It's a mixed bag, to be honest, because there is still a lot of mistrust and disinformation about vaccines in Taiwan or COVID in general. But at the same time, Taiwan's government and civil society have been very good at creating different interventions to reduce that harm. And so I think it remains to be seen. And then those specific narratives, the question asked are very recent, like the Afghanistan withdrawal, and I forget the other one you mentioned, Rachel, but they're very recent narratives, so it's hard to tell if they're really gaining traction or not yet. I think sometimes you just need time with these types of things.
Yeah, I want to supplement one more thing, as Melissa correctly mentioned that PRC have a guiding principle long before the digital technology is their cognitive warfare. They also make people exhausted and divided. But however, I want to also mention that there are different actors within PRC, and they have sometimes they perform their tasks parallel or even conflict. Like maybe the goal of State Department, the Department of State Security may not be always aligned with the goal of like the Youth League of CCP, and so on. Sometimes their actions are conflicts, and there are sometimes that PRC are there are many disinformation campaigns circulating inside of PRC, and they spill over to Taiwan. So what we see as disinformation campaigns in Taiwan may not really be intentional, but also spill over. Or some are intentional, but they are not really coordinated. And so far, I don't think that is an interesting part for further research, but that is the hard part that the original questions from the audience cannot be easily answered, because I don't think there are so many campaigns that is very well coordinated to make Taiwanese people believe a statement or argument. I don't think that is not very often the case. Okay.
Thank you. So our next question is about more offensive countermeasures. We've talked about defensive countermeasures, the disinformation attack from the PLA such as CCP, basically how Taiwan is mitigating the effects of these campaigns. But what is Taiwan doing to be more active to make other countries understand what is happening in Taiwan? What are the more kind of preventative or proactive measures Taiwan can take rather than a more defensive measure?
That is a hard one. And I think the Taiwanese people, no matter the government or like our foreign affairs ministries, or our civil society, always try to tell people around the world what Taiwan are facing and what kind of campaigns Taiwan are dealing with that. But I think the problem is that there is no not a formal standardized way, or they are, but there are not let me clarify. I mean, there have been no global consensus on how to make the communication about disinformation, about narrative warfare, standardized. I mean, there is no standardized terminology. There is no standardized ways to communications so that we can clearly express Taiwanese situation, or maybe a situation from the other country also influenced by the PRC, by the Russian, or by Iran. I don't know. And I think that is the hard part, because firstly, we don't have the standardized terminology and standardized way of measurement. And then we cannot say, okay, what is the scale of the campaign attacks, and how do we to counter this kind of attacks according to their scale or the nature or their narrative forms, and what kind of techniques can be utilized. I mean, I think in general, the research communities on disinformation or narrative warfare haven't have a consensus on that, but I think they should, and timing is become shorter, so we have to do it more quickly.
I'll add that, some offensive countermeasures could be in regulation and legislation, like Wilson just mentioned, but it can't just be from Taiwan, especially considering the fact that Taiwan is only one society in a really very global, it's a global ecosystem and industry. And so it would have to be something like the GDPR in the EU, where enough countries have come together and created like a standard accountability mechanism or way of regulating technology. But that would also really depend on these social media platforms being more transparent and agreeing to comply with anything like that. And at the end of the day, they need to be part of the conversation, and they're really trying to avoid that for the most part. I mean, for very specific, elections or situations, Facebook and other social media campaigns will create, action groups or task force within the institutions, but then they'll dissolve them when the situation is finished, such as for the U.S. presidential election. And so that it needs to be ongoing and sustainable, and we can't really talk about offensive countermeasures without talking about the social media platforms themselves and what they're willing to do and how they can work with governments and civil society. And we're just not they work together on an ad hoc basis, but in general, they're kind of trying to avoid that kind of, I think, overarching regulation.
Okay. Oh, thanks, Melissa. I want to add one more point, although I think I'm afraid that my argument is a little bit off topics, but it's interesting about the regulation of social platforms. I think the recent whistleblowing from Ms. Frances Haugen shows that there are already some good internal research within Facebook or maybe within other social platforms, but they are not revealed to the public, or they may not be constantly conducted. So I think one of the transparency regulations can focus one focus of the transparency regulation shall be that we can have some requirements on social platform that they can be audited, maybe from inside or some independent committee, or maybe just directly from government, that there are similar research based on internal data to show the impact of their algorithm or their policies or their maybe like their or maybe other measures, so that the research can be conducted and be revealed to the public, and the public do not have to know the exact internal data for the research, but the public shall know the methodology and the result based on the result of the research based on the internal data that cannot be easily accessible from the outside. And also, I think another kind of transparency is that I know there are some current research like the political advertisement observatory by the New York University. And I think that kind of research is good and essential to the general public, but this research I know is currently obstructed by the Facebook themselves. The Facebook claims the researcher violating their users' agreement and block their account. But I think that is I don't think Facebook do it in a good faith. So I think another transparency requirement is that social platforms shall not obstruct this kind of research. They can respond to the researcher and claiming that their methodology and their conclusion are not good enough to describe their efforts. But still, the researcher and the public shall do the research, and at least we can create legal shield from them, so that they will not be obstructed or even be sued by Facebook or other social platforms. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting discussion on how social media platforms can work with governments or civil society to be more transparent. Our next question is kind of going back to the emphasis on the local level. Our participant is wondering if, Wilson, you could speak, and Melissa as well, if you could speak to how Taiwan approaches the issue at the local level, as Taiwan also has different levels of government with different access to resources.
You mean to access the local level, right? Okay. I think when you mention local level is that I'm not sure how to explain the context and the background conditions of the phenomenon, but Taiwan, especially after after the 2014, they have a very robust civil society, and people often, when they have some wishes or they have some opinions on certain public issues, they just form something like working groups or very small activity groups, and then they go to the local communities to have some interactions. And sometimes, and most of the times they may fail, but after that they accumulate many experience, and then they know how to do it more smoothly and how to make good connection, make community work to with the resident. So I think it's a result of the practice, but I'm not sure how to formalize it appropriately. Sorry, but I think this is a very hard question, and it takes me a little bit more time to. I need more time to make it formalized. Sorry.
Actually, do you mind, Rachel, if I follow up that question to Wilson? Not to put you more on the spot, Wilson, but I'm actually curious, are there similar kind of debunking teams in the local governments in Taiwan? Because it's actually something I haven't heard much about. Or are local governments, like at the city level, working on countering disinformation the same way the national government is in Taiwan?
I think, that's an interesting question. Yes, some city level governments have a similar arrangement, but I have to say they may not have enough resources, like compared to the central government. And also I have to say, when things goes into the local government level, sometimes they are perceived as more somewhat partisan. I'm not sure how to describe it, but they cannot they haven't do it with the same level of trust with the central government, and I think I need more research to explain why is that. But the overall thing, the overall is the case that I see in Taiwan. I think one of the possible factors is that Taiwanese government, especially this administration, have recruited many young people into their government, and they have some interactions and have some discussion with the young culture, and also with many PR companies that are relatively familiar with how to deal with the online netizens. So they may acquire this kind of familiar familiarity in the central government, but I don't know this kind of factor really works well in the local one. Maybe they are just they didn't have enough source, or maybe the local politics structure does not encourage young people to get involved in. Maybe I think that is very hot topics, and I think they deserve more than one research project on the local politics to expand why is that.
Great, thank you. I was actually curious, you mentioned earlier that older populations in Taiwan are particularly vulnerable to disinformation, but I was wondering if you could speak more to kind of the targeted approach that Taiwan takes towards the older population, while also simultaneously making the efforts very palatable or engaging for young people. As you mentioned, young people tend to be more involved in the central government than the local government, and kind of how does Taiwan deal with the differences in access and understanding between younger populations and older populations when it comes to disinformation?
Okay, I think there are, the generation difference in Taiwan is very apparent. So there are different strategies. And for elder people, I just described, and for the younger one, I think I know there are some groups have like the one I mentioned in my report that have the training on the training for trainers. I mean, they have trainings for maybe like local community leaders, or maybe like maybe I say they train people, and the peoples comes from all generations. So all the generations, these people can develop good ways to fit the community he or she represented. So like I just mentioned that the game approach. I think the game approach on media literacy is actually developed under this kind of workflow, that there are young people know, okay, the harm of disinformation, how to discern them, how to verify them. And some young people just think, okay, we can gamify to make a game. And so they develop their own. So I think this kind of approach is another components make the Taiwanese strategy more diverse with respect to the generation difference. Yeah. So my first instinct on answering your question is that.
Also, would you like to add anything?
No, I think Wilson summed it up perfectly.
Great. Then I think we will turn to our last question. And Wilson, this one is directed towards you, but Melissa, I would be interested to hear if you have any thoughts as well. And it might touch a bit on DoubleThink Lab's other research too. Basically, it's asking about the kind of nature of the PRC disinformation campaigns and who is really behind them, and is wondering how people are being recruited and and who they are, how are they being recruited, and how are they being rewarded. And by they, I mean PRC, people in the PRC who are actually conducting these disinformation campaigns towards Taiwan or other countries.
I think this is the hard one, but okay. DoubleThink that hypothesis is that yes, there may be some people are recruited. For example, they are essentially the the people from the public office, like I know that Gary Kings has some research on that, but also there are some volunteers like the 50 cents. The people with 15 cents or Little Pink, they may be volunteer, but also there are also some local collaborators in Taiwan that received like PRC's fundings or trainings so that they can enforce the disinformation campaigns in Taiwan. And actually this category, this local collaborator category is the most harmful one, I think. And there are already some significant case in Taiwan, like some media they actually bluntly reveal that they are influenced by the PRC, but there are also some reports based on close or open intelligence to show that they are influenced by the PRC. So I think, yeah, they are recruited, but the way how they recruited and the way how they communicate to deliver the command of attack is I think we need to double think that, or maybe the Taiwanese government have to deal with, and that is the hardest part. It's actually more close to I think the traditional intelligence, the area of traditional intelligence, and I'm not familiar with that, so I can only say, okay, I can only say to this much of extent.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as Wilson, whereas that this is going more into like the inner workings of the CCP and how they conduct intelligence operations and how do they recruit local collaborators. It's not really in my wheelhouse, but I do think Wilson brings up an important point of reminding us that there are people in Taiwan who share disinformation either intentionally or unintentionally. They have their own interests, and not everyone is like on the same page in such a diverse society as Taiwan with such a complicated political and colonial history. And I think we should also remember there are local sort of domestic homegrown disinformation campaigns with their own intentions and their own goals that are happening at the same time. So yeah, I can't really speak to the question, but it's a very interesting one.
Thank you both so much. And we're nearing up on time, so I'd like to give you both the opportunity to say any final few words, anything that you'd like to discuss that we may not have touched on just before we sign off.
Okay. No, I think I elaborate most of the argument I want to make in this panel. Okay.
Yeah, no final thoughts for me other than thank you for having me again, and thank you, Wilson, for all your work.
Thank you.
And with that, I think we'll conclude. So thank you both so much for joining us today. This was a really fascinating discussion, and I know I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our attendees did as well. So thank you both so much. And Wilson, thank you for your hard work on the report. It was very informative, and I know at MBR we're very excited to publish it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.